Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our fifth virtual Diverse Ed event. This is our third panel. We've looked so far this morning at diverse children, the diverse curriculum, and now we're going to think about diverse staff. So I'm just going to introduce to you our five panelists for this panel. We have Jill Berry, a former head teacher, leadership consultant, and the author of Making the Leap. We have Louise, who is currently an assistant head, but soon to be deputy head teacher, and the co-founder of a newish network called Mix Ed. We have Shuaib, who is a teacher, sociologist, poet, and podcaster. We have Adam, a skit leader, a business teacher, and a doctorate student. And we have Rachel, the head of the interdisciplinary studies at Leeds Beckett University, one of our partners, and a researcher in racism, and ethnicity. Welcome to panel 3, everyone. It's fantastic to have you here. Jill, you're our first speaker, so please, over to you. Jill, we can't hear you. There's no audio coming out. How bizarre. You were absolutely fine in the practice yesterday. What you might want to do, Jill, is leave StreamYard and come back, and it might just kick the audio in. Why don't I go to Louise to kick us off, and then we'll come back to you in a second, Jill. So Louise, can I invite you to speak first?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me on. It's really nice to be here. Are you okay to hear me, Hannah? Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So I'm here this morning as with my Mix Ed hat on, as Hannah said, deputy from next year, which has been sort of my goal for this year. And I guess that leads in quite nicely into what Mix Ed is all about. So myself and Marcus Shepherd are both mixed race educators. And if you look at the statistics, despite being the largest growing ethnic group in the country, currently at senior leadership level, there's less than 1% of mixed race educators at senior leadership level. And even in the classroom, my own ethnic box that I would tick would be Black, African, White, British, and there's only 1% even in the classroom. So we are very much an underrepresented group, and Mix Ed is about that space and that platform for mixed race educators. Sometimes it's hard to occupy a space when you are mixed race, because sometimes you don't quite qualify for either group. If you're not white enough, you're not dark enough. But we experience racism and prejudice. We also sometimes have privilege. I know I certainly have white passing privilege, but at the same time, I've been the victim of racism throughout my life, growing up in Oldham in Lancashire. So it's a really unique position that we occupy, but often our voices are not really heard, and we don't have a space that we can occupy freely and safely. So Mix Ed is very much a platform to create that space for people. And in particularly, one of our drivers is to ensure that there is more representation and the issues around identity of being mixed race educator are looked into, particularly in the workplace. So it's about amplifying our voices. We're a very open platform and everybody is welcome. And we must remember identity is such a unique thing to individuals, and what you might appear as on the surface isn't necessarily your lived experience. Also, you can feel quite marginalized. It can be quite exhausting. I know for a fact that we've looked at, we have a group called the 1%, which we're hoping the name will change and it will one day be the 10% or something like that. So that's the name's hopefully going to be quite fluid. But the 1% is for anyone who's looking to increase their leadership responsibility in education. Please do join us because that's what we help you with. We can coach you. We've got a number of senior leaders who are mixed race who are on that platform. So that was just what I wanted to discuss today, but also linking into mixed race identity for our young people as well. We have done a little bit of work and research about how they feel as young people growing up as mixed race and the space that they occupy as well. So it's really interesting work. We've had loads of support and loads of really positive feedback. So do please join us and take a look at our work. And that was all from me for now, if that's all right, Hannah.
Thank you, Louise. Do you want to just mention about your name? Because I think that's an important thing to add.
Oh, right, yeah. So, yeah, originally, when I got married 10 years ago, I took my husband's name, Cooper, which I must admit, one of the reasons was it's easier than my original maiden name. But since becoming a deputy head and really thinking about my own sort of white passing privilege, as an act of allyship, I'm going to hyphenate my name from September back to my maiden name, so I'll be Louise John Bocas Cooper. So I need a new door sign and everything, so I'm causing quite a lot of extra cost in to my school with my new door signs that I'm being quite diva-ish about, but started to use that as my new email signature. It feels really right, it feels like me, and it's possibly one of the best decisions I've made this year, so I'm really happy to be back being Louise John Bocas Cooper. And just having that foreign sounding surname as an act of allyship. I've forgotten how hard it is to explain people how to pronounce it, though.
Thank you so much, Louise. Lovely to hear from you, and it's great to have you here today. Welcoming Jill back to the panel. Jill, I think you have got sound now. Do you want to unmute yourself and we can see whether we can hear you, Jill? Jill, can you hear me? Doesn't look like it. Okay, so in which case, Shuaib, can I invite you to share your input and we'll try and sort out Jill's technical issues. So welcome to the panel, Shuaib.
Hello, Benny, and hello, Hannah. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm Shuaib Khan. I think the tagline, the strapline for this was called Finding Your Voice. I'm on a journey. I think everyone knows that. I'm on a massive journey myself. My name is Shuaib Khan, teacher of humanities, host of Anti-Small Talk podcast. My identity is kind of split into many different elements. So I'd consider myself as a British Pakistani Muslim educator. Each of those need to be unpacked individually, and gaining a sense of self-pride with each of them has been something that I've been learning more and more over the past year or so, particularly past 18 months since the pandemic started. I think the whole notion of finding your voice is what made me voiceless. And if I go back to the work of Nika Shukla, she talks about the notion of the good immigrant, doing things by the book, not raising your head up too high, sort of retaining a sense of self-respect and not overtly displaying your identity. Right throughout my childhood, really up until the past year, I was very much focused on just getting by. And more and more, the more and more the good immigrant image, I tried to use it more and more, the more sort of like clash I had with my own culture. So embracing my own culture is something that's really, really important for me. And I think for me, the rise to prominence really started when I wrote a blog called Microaggressions or Micro-Racism. I actually encountered them at a parents' evening. Didn't really know what to make of them because I was quite silent. I didn't really know how to articulate myself. And as time has gone on more and more, I think it's really important to now express a sense of self-pride in my identity, also shed light on the experience of people in my community, because I don't believe there's many people who are able to hold conversations about the Pakistani British Muslim community the way that I can. I think it's about having that dialogue and making sure that this group of students in particular are given a voice, because there's a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of miscommunication, and particularly what's going on right now in the world. I think it's really important that we open up safe spaces for all children. And by that, that means children that look just like me, who are in school just like me. I've got a 17-year-old nephew who tells me everything. He's my ears and eyes down at the very classroom level. I'm also in the classroom myself, but it's vital that I have that dialogue more and more, and we unpack these inequalities and we allow other people to find their voice. So my journey carries on. I'm unlearning and I'm learning every single day. There's so much more to learn, and this is why I'm here.
Shuaib, I love that. You've got a minute left. Do you want to do a plug for your podcast and the premise of your podcast?
Okay, so it's called Anti-Small Talk, # Anti-Small Talk. I also work with Teacher Hug Radio, so shout out to Paul Dix as well. I work with Teacher Hug Radio. Again, if you want to be a part of it, please let me know. Find me on Twitter. We'll have that dialogue as well. So yeah, Anti-Small Talk is a way of just allowing educators to have their voice heard, regardless of how big or small your platform is. We want to hear from you, because once upon a time, that was me with 5 followers, and now we've got some sort of voice. Let's try and bring other people to the table and have their voice heard as well.
I love that, Shuaib, finding your own voice, but then amplifying other people's voices as well. So thank you so much for the work you do. So Jill, let's see whether third time lucky we can bring you onto the panel. Have you now got sound, Jill Berry?
I hope I have.
You have. Okay, over to you, Jill.
I love technology, me. So I finished headship in 2010. And since then, I've spent a fair amount of time working with serving and aspiring leaders at all levels, just supporting challenge step to be the best leaders they can possibly be, to fulfill their personal and professional ambitions. And it's been a hugely satisfying and energizing part of my post-career life, as I like to call it. So I was involved in supporting Women Ed from the very beginning. And since BAME, LGBT Ed, Disability Ed came on stream, and our awareness of the crucial importance of diversity and equity and inclusion, as that's grown, I've been committed to supporting diverse leaders. And that's meant that I've had to learn more, I've had to read more, to watch, to listen, to raise my awareness of the perspectives and experiences of those whose lives may be quite different from my own in a number of ways. So I've been committed to being an ally, and I'm very keen to encourage all educators to be allies, but especially those with leadership responsibility, to use their influence in order to empower others, especially people from underrepresented groups. Because we need strong leaders at all levels, middle leaders, senior leaders, heads and executive heads. So whether you're leading a team or a school or a group of schools, it's really important, I think, that we have a diverse and inclusive workforce that reflects the communities we serve and the world we live in, so that there are role models and high profile examples of what our pupils can achieve, but also so that we make the absolute most of the strengths and the range of talents of everyone, and not just a few. So in terms of coaching, mentoring, supporting and developing leaders, whatever their background, their identity and their lived experience, there are three things I think are especially important, and that's what I want to say something about in the next couple of minutes. I think leading, the first thing, is about getting the best from others. And to do that, we need to ensure that we see the best in them and that they can see it in themselves. So strong leaders spot potential in people who don't yet believe that they're capable of doing that themselves. So that's my first point. Can you help those you lead, those you interact with, to give themselves credit for what they've achieved, and crucially, for what they could achieve in the future? We all need to find the bright spots and help others to do the same, so that no one undervalues themselves or their potential. So show those you lead that you value what they are now, but you also see what they're capable of becoming. And secondly, clearly related to the first point, it's about building the most positive, mutually trusting and respectful relationships. And it's about communicating. So really listening, being receptive, showing empathy, trying very hard to see things from someone else's point of view. So to borrow Nancy Klein's words, it's about seeking to understand rather than seeking to convince. So in your relationships with those you're supporting, you need constantly to be building bridges and breaking down walls. And thirdly, finally, never lose a strong sense of hope and a sense of the possible. It's 10 years old now, but in the early years of my headship, I read The Art of Possibility, Transforming Professional and Personal Life. It's about Benjamin and Rosamund Zander. And I found it a transformative read. We need to see what is possible for ourselves and for others. We need to make sure that other people see that too. And so sometimes we're held back by our fear of failure, our inability to face the possibility of disappointment, our anxiety about risk. And if you're coaching, mentoring, supporting and developing diverse leaders, I think you need a really clear sense of and commitment to what is possible. So quick example, I recently supported a woman who was applying for an assistant principal job in her own school, and she almost didn't apply. And when I asked her what was holding her back, she said, "I don't like to fail." And I said, no one likes to fail, but if you're not prepared to risk failure, then you won't taste success. And in the end, it wasn't my words. It was her 13-year-old son who said to her, "Mum, if you don't apply, you have failed." And that made her apply. She went through a robust and rigorous selection process, and she got the job. Woo! So pleased, so thrilled for her. So this is it. If you're supporting the development of diverse leaders, please remember these 3 things. And I'm sorry my connection has been so rubbish. Find the bright spots, help them to see them too. Secondly, connect and communicate. And thirdly, have hope and see what's possible. So thank you for listening. That was me.
Jill, thank you so much for persevering. I've got a vision of John on the roof holding the area up whilst you're trying to speak, but thank you so much. We did hear most of what you said. Let me now move on to Adam. Thank you so much, Jill. That'd be fabulous. Okay, Adam, can I welcome you onto the panel now, please?
Thanks, Hannah. Morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here. It's been great to hear all the presentations this morning, really inspiring stuff. My name's Adam, and as Hannah said at the start, I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 12 years, and hopefully I'm just wrapping up my thesis where I'm researching the experiences of LGBT secondary school teachers, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So just as a starting point, a bit of context, I started school in 1995, so slap bang in the middle of Section 28, which Kirsty referred to earlier. So at a time when, we all know it was illegal to talk or promote homosexuality. So as I got older and really dug into this and learnt about it, I got retrospectively angry about the impact it had on me and a whole generation of LGBT, well, young people at the time, but now adults, and how we've been taught through the hidden curriculum to learn shame and how embedded that is. So fast forward 20-ish years, now as a teacher, I wanted to think about what the impact is and what the experiences are of LGBT teachers are today. So there are an estimated 50,000 LGBT teachers sorry, the comments are throwing me off. There's an estimated 50,000 teachers in the UK that and I want to think about what their experiences are. Now, schools are generally experienced as very heteronormative environments, stubbornly so, and everyone's nodding because we know exactly that's the truth, where heterosexuality and being cisgendered is silently assumed, and if you're LGBT, you often stand in very stark visible contrast to that. Now, Patai describes that as surplus visibility, where we are either extrapolated from part to whole, and we're considered to be, that's the only part of our identity, or we represent the entire minority group, which is pretty exhausting and obviously utterly unrealistic. So I think those are things to consider. So I went into my research thinking, actually, it's probably going to be quite bleak to find out what the experiences of LGBT secondary school teachers are. Almost all the literature paints it as a pretty horrific place to be as an LGBT person. If you read the literature before applying, you would not apply. You would not want to be an LGBT teacher. So for me, I wanted to find some more positive narratives because it looks on paper like it's a pretty bad thing to do. And thankfully, that is what I have found. Through my research, I did a photo elicitation research project where the teachers took photos of spaces in school that represented safe and unsafe spaces for them. Of course, there were unsafe spaces. They are still very heteronormative, but there were huge amounts of spaces where they felt not only safe, but empowered. And that was really, really interesting. And actually what they started to describe was this act of transgression, because in the classroom, I had teachers that wanted to be visibly open, to be the role models they didn't have as children. And some people were forced to address a visible difference, what we might call the glass closet. So for example, I had a teacher who was transitioning, so it was very clear that that was the case, or, sort of stereotypically camp man, and it was obvious he was gay, for example. So they were either willing to or forced to address this difference with the group. But as a consequence, what happened is they had these very, very powerful, very important, very meaningful relationships with students, and they created empathy in their students. And actually, they were creating armies of allies. And they described these scenarios where these students not only were looking out for them, but they went around the school correcting other teachers' inappropriate use of language, the microaggressions that we talked about earlier, and actually really radically transgressing the school. So I think we can describe this idea as almost a form of gay or queer capital, where if you're able to or willing to, it's always safety first, be visible as a teacher, you can transgress and progress the culture of your schools quite radically, which I think is incredible. Now, Catherine Lee wrote a piece last year saying that actually LGBT teachers could make fantastic leaders in schools. And she talked about that actually our lived experiences make us potentially, not all of us, I'm sure, good leaders. Perhaps we've got skills in reading people, compassion and commitment, courage and risk-taking. And those all come from our lived experiences and actually hopefully make us better leaders and empathizers as a consequence of that. So I recently started a podcast called Pride and Progress, where each week we interview LGBT, either educators or allies, and they talk about their experiences. And these stories came through more and more and more, these positive transgressive experiences with queer capital. And we spoke with one teacher, whose name is George, he's in the first episode, who's a trans RE teacher in a Catholic school, which on paper you must think is a hell of a time, but actually he described the experiences I've described. The students became allies, and he very quietly, very radically progressed the culture of his school, which was just amazing to hear. So just to summarise, schools still are very heteronormative. We've got a lot of work to do. I don't make it too lopsided, but we do need to present more positive narratives, because actually, yes, there are challenges, but actually there's a huge amount of things that come from being an LGBT teacher. And if you're able and willing to be visible, not only can it create this form of queer or gay capital, you can be the role model for young people that you needed when you were young. Thank you very much.
Adam, thank you so much. I'm so interested in your research. I can see people taking down lots and lots of notes. Yeah, absolutely fantastic findings. Looking forward to hearing more about that. And our final speaker, Rachel, welcome to the panel. Over to you.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. I don't know, I'm going to follow everybody that I'm actually following, because everyone's been really amazing. So I'll jump straight in. As Hannah mentioned, I'm the head of interdisciplinary studies at Leeds Beckett. I've been in HE for 10 years. Prior to that, I was a primary school teacher for 7 years. As you can probably see, I'm a mixed race woman, and that's what I want to talk about this morning, how we empower our mixed race primary school children. And I'm focusing on primary quite specifically. If I can just give you some figures just to start off with, currently, we have the total school population, 5.5% of that population is made up of mixed race children. And that's a significantly larger number than it was. In terms of growth between 2003 and 2017, the mixed race community of children grew 130%. We are, as Louise mentioned earlier, the fastest growing community in the country, according to the census information, and it's predicted by 2070, we will be the largest community next to the white British community. So our role as teachers, as educators, really needs to be aligned with the fact that the children that we're teaching are going to come from a variety of diverse backgrounds. Now, in terms of calling the group mixed race, we are then presenting the group as one homogenous group of people, and we know that's not the case. Now, in terms of achievement, if we look at the group as homogenous, then mixed race children are performing at the national average, and that sounds like really great news on the surface, but unfortunately that's not the real picture. In terms of dividing our children up into the groups in which they inhabit, for example, white British and Black Caribbean boys are amongst the lowest performing group in the country, and that is throughout school, not just in primary school, that is indeed into secondary school. And their achievement shows decline from the moment that they enter primary school. So they start primary school with achievement that is just under the national average. As their peers progress, they begin to decline right up until the age of 14. At 14, we then see an increase slightly in achievement, and we need to look at why that doesn't happen until they're 14. So essentially, it's about looking at what we're doing in primary schools. Now, in terms of what we need to do as educators, well, the first thing we need to do is empower our communities of children, and we do that by acknowledging their position, and we do that by acknowledging their experiences. I can certainly say that's the case for me, both personally and professionally. The moment somebody saw me as mixed race, I was empowered from that moment as a child. I went to an all-white, very middle-class, leafy school in Liverpool and stood out like a sore thumb. Not a comfortable position to be in, but the moment you are seen by your teachers, by the staff at your school, you're then empowered from that moment. Now, it's about what we do with that positively, because the lived experience of children from all non-white British backgrounds are complicated and indeed intricate. And for schools, it's about starting with the basics in terms of belonging. What imagery are we showing our kids in terms of the characters that are displayed around classrooms and corridors? Who are the characters in the books and the stories that we read with our children? Then in terms of role models, who are we holding up as role models? Will the children see themselves in those role models? I can categorically say never once at primary school did I see myself reflected in anybody that was held up as somebody to aspire to be. In terms of very, very simple measures like getting coloured pencils, at school I could never draw myself because there was either a really dark brown pencil or there was a white pencil, and trying to mix the two really didn't work. So very, very simple things like that. In terms of fundamental British values, this is a real opportunity for us to use fundamental British values, which I critique in my research all the time, as a process of teaching anti-racism. To be British is to be diverse. Our mixed race children must see themselves reflected in those elements of our teaching. And I'm just going to finish here. I know I'm running out of time. I could talk to you all day about this, as I'm sure you can imagine. To finish up, I just want to say that as mixed race children, we're often referred to as half and half. We're not half, we're both. We're often referred to as mixed, and we're not mixed, we're all. Thank you.
Rachel, I love that. I could listen to you all day. When we do finally get ourselves to Leeds for a face-to-face event, we will be giving you a bit longer to talk about your research. I'm going to hand over to Benny now, who's been moderating the chat and furiously writing down notes to pose some questions to you. So over to you, Benny.
Fantastic. We've actually got very few questions in the chat themselves, so I encourage people who are listening to send in some of your specific questions. But I have questions. I always have questions, and they're entirely selfish because I'm mining information to formulate my own thoughts here. And I wanted to go back to this idea of kind of dual heritage and mixed race. I mean, the language in itself is a minefield, and people use different language to describe identities. And I want to come to you, Louise. You talked about the fact that there is privilege and you've experienced racism, and part of your identity is kind of straddling that line and not really knowing which side that you'll be accepted by. But I want to know what assumptions people have made about you, about your abilities, your experiences as somebody of dual heritage. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting concept because it is kind of, who are you is kind of the thing that you get. You constantly have to define yourself to other people. So I'll often get, where are you from? Where are you really from? Is one, a classic. Obviously, the maiden name gave me away a lot of the time, but being Cooper now for 10 years has made me a little bit more hidden. So then you get this, oh, are you Greek? Are you Italian? And then when I tell people about my heritage and that half my family's Muslim, you then get questions about that. Do you fast? Do you not? Why don't you wear a headscarf? Why do you practice? What religion are you? Is that a problem? So I mean, it's great, and I'm really careful because I don't mind people asking me questions at all, and I'm happy to talk. And one of the things I've done as a senior leader and as a teacher is I've always been very open with students. But going to my school, which I am now staying on as deputy, which is brilliant, which is predominantly white British, I made it very clear from day one about my heritage. And then students started coming to me. A lot of students started to come to me, not just the mixed race ones, but Black, any kind of ethnicity, Muslim girls who knew that I came from a Muslim background. So they found allyship in me. And I guess that brings with it a burden as well, because I can't answer everybody's questions and I don't know everything. But it's about being accepted. You often face microaggressions. You're judged on who you've married. Have you betrayed one side by marrying into another? Should you marry another mixed race person? What do your children look like? Let's not go there with Harry and Meghan. But it's kind of things like that. You're constantly questioned, and it's quite exhausting to have that. And then that makes me wonder, is that the reason we're underrepresented in senior leadership? Because we have to navigate so much that can be quite fatiguing and possibly is a barrier to actually just getting on with your career and going for it. So I'm really focused on leadership and empowering people at any level, not just senior leadership. Governance as well is a huge one in education, is to make us more diverse. And I'm a historian as well, Shuaib is a humanities teacher, and it's talking about identity there as well. You don't know who's in your classroom, and a lot of the time students hide identity. So you might have someone who's got a Polish mix in them, who feels very self-conscious and hears sort of racism about immigrants or whatever, and then hides that identity. We're doing at our school a Black identity focus group next week, and I've got a boy who's got the most wonderful hair on the planet, and he's a quarter Jamaican, so he appears completely 100% white passing, but I am making sure he is invited to that group, because his hair is Afro hair, and he has lots of microaggressions about his hair, unwanted attention, unwanted physical contact. So I need to make sure he is at that table, even though he might not look like he should be there. And that's the kind of space I want. I just want that space where people feel welcome. There's space for everybody. There's no need for it to be polarized. And that's my worry sometimes. That's what I really am passionate about. And that's what Mixed Ed is all about.
And I can definitely hear it coming through. And, you know, there are so many nuances here. And we are just about getting to grips with the idea of different ethnicities. And when we start talking about dual ethnicity and dual heritage, there's a whole other minefield to navigate. And staying on the topic of dual heritage and kind of straddling identities, Rachel, you know, when we talk about the statistics, as a question on where people find data on dual heritage children. Where have you gone to for this information?
To be honest, it's a bit of a difficult one. It's, for me, contacting local authorities. Lambeth in London have done some really interesting work about mixed race children. So I've been in touch with them in terms of their statistics. The school census information is produced by the DFE, so we can get hold of that. It's about being careful around the data that you get, because as I said before, we have to drill down into it. A lot of the data that's produced talks about homogenous groups and gives a completely false picture, because when I first started doing this work, it was about, oh, mixed race children are performing at the national average, there's no problem. And that was really distracting in terms of the priorities that we have in schools. And it was diluting the issue that I knew and that my colleagues all knew existed. So DFE, individual local authorities, I would say, would be more accurate than getting generalized pictures from the DFE. And then it's about talking to other researchers who've done work in this area prior. I'm really lucky at Leeds Beckett. I'm surrounded by brilliance. So it's a case of knocking out an email to, I mean, we have Professor Vinnie Lander, who is, you know, leading in the field of research around race, so, or popping a phone call to her. So it's knowing who's doing this work and actually asking the questions of them. I think data is a very blunt tool still. And I do not hold much value around the data. For me, the qualitative aspect of this research is the most powerful. It's the conversations that I have with children. It's the conversations that I have with other colleagues, particularly, as Louise has already mentioned, other mixed race teachers who've walked the walk that I have, who've been on the journey that I have. They're the powerful narratives that come through, because the data really tells you a teeny bit of experience. And I think the key in this particular area in education is understanding experience, is listening to those stories. The numbers tell us a little bit, but it's those messages through the narratives that I think will really move us forward.
Thank you. And certainly, you know, when I've been doing some research around this, the unpicking where to get information from and where to cross-reference it's really tricky, you know, and we know how powerful the numbers are. We know how powerful that can be as a message. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to stay with the idea of identities, and particularly around kind of race and culture. Shuaib, I'm going to come to you on this one, because you talked about the good immigrant narrative. So when we are navigating our identities as teachers, you know, we pick and choose parts of ourselves to show. And you talked about the idea of kind of suppressing parts of yourself and quietening parts of yourself to fit into a particular narrative around the good immigrant. Can you talk us through the bits that you pushed down? What did you avoid, you know, that you perhaps have re-embraced about yourself now that you're in the role that you're in?
That's a really good question. For me, I did not want people to know that I was a Muslim. That was a no-no, and they couldn't know I was Pakistani. Those two things, you know, I just couldn't tell people. It was when I did forms, applications, I totally ignored it. Often when they'd ask me where I'm from, I'd say India. I'd just completely try and ignore those two identities. What's happened, I think, particularly in the past year, more and more, I've had to go back to sort of when my granddad arrived to the UK, and he was so proud of being Pakistani Muslim, but he never openly able to articulate that sense of pride. Years on, being able to go to higher education, having the privileges that I have got now, you know, 30, 40, 50 years on, I've now begun to bring that more into conversation. And what's happened is the students have opened up to me more about their identity. So when I'm talking to Pakistani Muslim boys, they are talking to me what upsets them, how frustrated they are with certain structures. And then I can articulate that to my senior leadership, who are absolutely wonderful. They are really supportive of me. I'm very fortunate in that regard. So I think I was suppressing certain elements of my identity and maybe even elevating others. The fact that I went into higher education, that I, did the good immigrant stuff. I ticked all the boxes. But once the boxes were all ticked, there was children who were unable to access those boxes. And now I'm trying to articulate that and be sort of someone they can reflect their views onto and gain support from. So this is a long journey. I'm still learning more and more about myself. I'm learning about each individual part of the identity, and also what spaces I feel comfortable sharing my identity as well. I think it's a very much a personal conversation we need to be having, but it did start with very much realizing there are students who are not having their voices heard. And by this, I'm referring to Pakistani British students. They're not having their stories heard, and they're feeling uncomfortable. They're being, possibly misjudged, etc. So it was important for me to start opening up and having that dialogue. And I think it has had a massive impact on my own sort of development as a teacher. And I think hopefully it's had an impact on the rapports I'm striking with these students. So what I would suggest to everyone is that you have to present an authentic sense of yourself at every opportunity. And let's hope we all can start doing that more and more, because nothing beats authenticity.
Fantastic. Yeah. And, we've talked about authenticity over the years at Diverse Ed. And one book that I would recommend, was talking about authenticity is Aisha Small's book, The Unexpected Leader, where she talks about that in detail. And kind of this idea of representation and shame, I think, came through when Adam was talking. Adam, I'm coming to you now and talking about, the fact that, when there are parts of our identity that are seen as other and you recognize and are recognized socially as other, that engenders shame. And what impact does that have on our young people and our staff when they are navigating their school career or their education?
I mean, we could talk about that for hours, couldn't we? That's a massive question. And, I talked about getting retrospectively angry because you don't know at the time, because all you know is what you know, until you get older and think retrospectively about what education should look like and the value of education, the purpose of education, and realize how badly done by we were. I'm not sure this is answering your question, but what I think is interesting in that area is the idea of intersectionality, because, as a white middle-class gay teacher, actually, I'm pretty what we call homonormative. So there's literature around that talking about which types of LGBT identities are okay and which ones are not okay, which ones are included, which aren't. And that's what I was more interested in the research. So, if you're just a gay or lesbian teacher, actually you get kind of an easier ride than if you're, for example, a non-binary teacher, or perhaps a trans teacher that doesn't fit in the binaries of male and female. So I think I'm not quite sure this is answering the question, but I think that's an interesting discussion to think about, because we've made progress. And some identities are included, but that is at the exclusion of others. And that's not inclusion, is it? So I think that's something that would be interesting to consider more.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's a really valid point around this, the idea of privilege. And we talked about passing, and we talked about kind of the relative privileges of us as staff in schools, and how actually that's not a conversation we have very often, because it feels uncomfortable to admit privilege, to kind of say, actually, no, I've had an easier ride or a worse ride than you, almost as if it's a competition. I want to come to you, Jill, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you on this one, about the idea of recruitment. And when we are building these communities that are more diverse and more representative, one of the criticisms I've heard of trying to do this work, it's fairly insidious, so I apologize, is that it's a form of positive discrimination. That if we are actively seeking more diverse communities, we're not really going on merit. So how do you respond to that when you talk about kind of building these diverse communities in our schools?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Jill.
There might be a delay. I don't have the problem with positive discrimination that some people seem to have, because I just see it as redressing a balance. And I don't think it's at odds with the idea of merit, because you want the best possible people, but you just want to widen the net and make sure you're not missing the best possible people, because they don't necessarily fill a particular
box or look like most people on the staff. So I think it's about obviously challenging bias of all types, being aware of unconscious bias as far as we can, and giving everybody credit. But it's also really about building the confidence of those who recognise they may be in a minority in a school in the beginning, but if they're not prepared to go for a job, that will never change. So recently I was working with a young Asian woman who was applying for a deputy headship. She said, but there are so few people like me on the staff, even though there are quite a lot of people like me within the pupil body. And I said, that's exactly why you need to go for it, and I will give you every support. So sorry if that's been a bit hit and miss. Hope you got the gist of it, Benny.
We did. It was strangely clear at the end. It was fantastic. But no, I take your point. You know, and when I say that this is a criticism leveled at diverse representation, obviously I don't agree with it, and I can see that you don't either. There's a couple of other questions, and I think it's kind of going back to this idea of kind of what we have in common, and how do we show that to our students and to our staff. So I want to go back to Rachel for a second. You talked about not being half. You talked about the idea of, you know, I'm both. And when we talk in curricular terms, when we teach particularly young children, we often teach identities in silos. So what can teachers do to bridge that gap? How do we show the commonalities between cultures so that some of our students with dual heritage aren't trying to put themselves into pockets?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Benny. It's almost like one of those really challenging games of physical twister when you're mixed race and you're trying to put yourself into a category. And I have a real issue with the terminology. So things like dual and bi for me indicate two. Well, my mum's white British. My dad's family are primarily from Barbados, but then we have this whole African arm of the family as well. So it really was like a game of twister. I think in terms of bridging the gap, it's about us acknowledging that diversity is exactly as it says on the tin. It is difference. It is a mixture. My dad, when we were kids, used to tell us that we were rainbows, and that vision for me was really, really powerful. I still use that today, because people, as Louise said earlier, well, where are you really from? And I'm often asked, when my father came to this country, and it wasn't my father, it was my great-grandfather who came from Barbados. So we're a really old Liverpool family. And people are disappointed with that because it doesn't fit into their narrative of, oh, they all came on the Windrush. And essentially, for me, it's about teachers acknowledging that everybody is different, that we don't all fit into one particular formula. If you're mixed race, you're not half and half necessarily, you are both. And as I said before, we are all. And I think it's about teachers talking about this openly, normalizing diversity through the practices of teaching in terms of who we hold up as role models, who we discuss. And I think we are at a pivotal moment, and I say this every time I speak publicly, we are at a pivotal moment in the discussion around race and racism, because we've had several things happen in the global media that the children in schools know about, because they always know. The messages, the things that are happening, reach them by osmosis. They overhear things. I think the job of teachers is to acknowledge this. For example, the discussions around Meghan and Harry, as some of you are probably already aware, I've talked about that, you know, endlessly in the media. That is an opportunity. It's not about the royal family necessarily. It's about the diversity that exists within British society. It's not about Meghan and Harry. It's about two people who love each other, who have created a child and now two children together. What does that tell us? So it's using those themes to introduce discussion in the classroom. And all we need to do in terms of bridging the gap is look at each other, because I never once knew a class of children in the years, the hundreds of kids that I've taught, who started from a place of no. started from a place of resistance and started from a place of racism. Once we opened the discussion and I shared my experience with them, the kids wanted to talk about nothing else. And I worked in Huyton in Liverpool, where Anthony Walker was murdered. And as we know, that was a racist attack, and that young man lost his life. This was the area in which I was teaching, and not one child came into my classroom from a place of no. And I think we have a unique position in primary schools to start the dialogue early, to look at each other and to really acknowledge what brings us together.
Thank you, Rachel. I like Hannah said, we could listen to all of you for so much longer than we have, but I'm going to ask you now to round up for your diverse ed pledges. It's a one sentence each, so we can wrap up. I'm going to start with you, Adam. Adam, what's your diverse ed pledge?
We talked about the difficulty of language around race sometimes. So for me, that's something to work on. Like, I loved Rachel described it as not half, not mixed, but all. And I think that's such powerful language. So to use more of that inclusive language in the classroom.
Thank you, Adam. Louise?
My diverse ed pledge is to continue to support and amplify the voices of mixed race educators.
Thank you, Louise. Shuaib?
My diverse ed pledge is to carry on learning and unlearning, to embed empathy and keep challenging those broken systems. That's what's really important. A lot of broken systems out there. We need to carry on challenging them.
Thank you, Shuaib. That's really powerful. And finally, Rachel, I'm going to read yours out, Jill, for the connection issues.
My diverse pledge is to leave the ladder down. And what I mean by that is to leave the ladder down for other colleagues, for the children that are coming up through our system, and to help them up the ladder.
Fab. And Jill has posted hers. She says her pledge is we have to make the most of the skills in everyone, and that might mean helping everyone to have confidence and to see their potential, which is a really powerful note to end on. Thank you so much, everybody who has come along today, who are listening. We are going to take a 15-minute break, so go and grab yourselves a cup of tea. Thank you, panelists, and hopefully we'll hear again from you soon. Take care. Back at 12.